The morning sun was still low over the eastern Mediterranean as Adunirari pressed his stylus into the damp clay. 29 lines of cuneiform that morning, each one as precise as the copper ingots he would inspect shortly. The palace scribe of Enkomi wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Even at this early hour, the summer heat already hung over the harbor fortress like a wet cloth. Below him, beyond the massive stone parapet, the harbor was awakening to life. Phoenician traders unrolled their colorful bales of cloth, Cypriot fishermen unloaded their silvery catches, and Egyptian envoys strode majestically along the quay walls. The familiar cries of seagulls mingled with the creaking of cedar wood and the rhythmic clapping of waves against the mole. Adunirari drew in the salty air and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His fingers glided over the stacked clay tablets of the archive, inventory lists, diplomatic correspondence, tax registers. For 23 years he had now served the king of Wallachia, 23 years of impeccable record-keeping. Every oxhide-shaped copper ingot that left this kingdom bore his seal. Every shipment to Amarna, Ugarit, or Byblos passed his inspection. He turned to the parapet and let his gaze wander over the shimmering sea. The fishing boats were returning earlier than usual, their men appearing hurried, almost flustered. One of them gesticulated wildly towards a Phoenician merchant, who promptly packed away his wares without completing a single transaction. Unusual. Adunirari mechanically reached for an unmarked clay tablet. Fishermen of Enkomi returned before the 9th hour. He incised into the soft clay. Behavior restless. Cause unclear. He carefully dried the tablet in the morning sun and placed it among the other observations of the day. Probably nothing. Probably just the heat fraying the men's nerves. He would follow up tomorrow. Someone would look into it tomorrow. Today the copper waited. Today order waited. The copper storehouses of Enkomi lay in the cool shadow of the palace walls, a vast vault of dressed limestone that held the kingdom's greatest wealth. Adunirari paced the rows of stacked oxhide ingots, his sandals clicking softly on the compacted clay floor. Each ingot bore the royal seal of Wallachia, a stylized bull figure, stamped into the still warm metal before it cooled. He counted 47 for the shipment to Amarna, 12 for Ugarit, 23 as reserve. Copper was the blood of the world. Without it, no bronze. Without bronze, no weapons, no plows, no temple gates. The pharaohs needed it for their chariots, the Hittites for their swords, the Minoans for their ornate vessels. And they all came to Cyprus. All bargained with the king of Wallachia, and all eventually passed through this storehouse and Adunirari's critical gaze. A Phoenician merchant was already waiting at the entrance, a slender man with a dyed woolen cloak and the calculating smile of someone who knew the value of an item before his counterpart had even spoken it. Adunirari had known him for years. He traded reliably, albeit at prices that regularly infuriated the palace scribe. "Prices are rising," the Phoenician said casually as he weighed one of the ingots in his hands. "In the Levant, they are now paying double." "The Levant is far," Adunirari replied curtly. "Not far enough." The merchant lowered his voice. "There is unrest in the west, sailors without a king, some say, fishing villages that no longer answer when ships come in." Adunirari thought of the last letter from Amarna. Pharaoh Akhenaten had demanded more copper, offered gold in exchange, and casually mentioned certain difficulties with foreign ships. The scribe had dismissed it as Egyptian exaggeration. Egyptians tended towards drama. Everyone knew that. He drew his own seal from his belt pouch and marked the 47 ingots for transport. 7 days until loading, 3 weeks until arrival in Amarna, arriving in time for the festival of the Nile. Reliable as the stars, predictable as the seasons. Adunirari smiled and patted the Phoenician on the shoulder. "Sailors without a king," he murmured, as he left the storehouse, "are still sailors, and every ship needs a harbor." 3 months before the fog, 3 months before Enkomi burned, Adunirari had received an Egyptian envoy whose words still echoed in his mind. The man had been exhausted, his linen garment crusted with salt, his eyes red from too many nights on deck. He had reported on burning coastal villages in the Levant, on seafarers without a king, who appeared from nowhere and vanished into nothingness. "They come with the first light," the envoy had said, his voice breaking, "and when the sun is high, nothing remains but ash and blood." Adu-Nirari had dismissed the reports as exaggerations. Egyptians inclined towards drama. Every scribe who worked with their diplomatic tablets knew this. Their letters overflowed with flattering formulae and apocalyptic descriptions. A poor harvest was never merely a poor harvest. It was always divine retribution. Nevertheless, the king of Alashia had reacted. For a week, the guards had been reinforced. For a week, soldiers had stood on the rampart, staring out at the empty sea. But the copper mines needed every man. The furnaces consumed labor, and when no enemy sail appeared on the horizon, caution gave way to routine. The guards returned to the mines. The warnings were filed away in the archive. Daily life triumphed over fear. Adu-Nirari had himself shelved the envoy's tablets deep in the vault, amongst old tax registers and long-fulfilled trade agreements. He still remembered the slight hesitation in his hand before he put them away, a fleeting unease he had brushed off as fatigue. The summer had been hot, the work oppressive, and the fears of foreign kings were not his concern. The lamps in the palace archive had been burning for hours as Adu-Nirari entered the final oxhide ingot into his annual inventory. The scratching of the reed stylus on damp clay was the only sound in the stifling silence, a familiar rhythm, almost meditative. The smell of burning olive oil mingled with the earthy scent of the clay tablets that filled the shelves in neat stacks. He leaned back and massaged his aching temples. The figures were correct. They were always correct. 23 years in the service of the king of Alashia, and not a single discrepancy had ever left his desk. His gaze fell upon a small votive figure made of terracotta, which his son had shaped for him before departing for Ugarit, an awkward man with an oversized stylus. The boy was now learning the art of writing in the famous school of the port city, under the best teachers that his salary could afford. Adu-Nirari allowed himself a rare smile. A cough broke his concentration. The guard, a young man with a sun-tanned face and nervous fingers, stood in the doorway. "Scribe, the harbor fires at Kitchen are out." Adu-Nirari frowned. Kitchen was a half-day's journey to the southeast. Its beacon fires on the cliffs were normally visible until late into the night, a familiar light on the horizon, as reliable as the moon. When, an hour ago I'd estimate, a fisherman reported it. An hour. Adu-Nirari thought of the boats that had returned hastily that morning, of the men's agitated gesticulation. Then he pushed the thought aside. Probably just damp fuel. A negligent sentry. Not his responsibility. "Too late for an alarm," he said finally, turning down the wick of his oil lamp. "We will check it in the morning." The soldier hesitated, as if wanting to object. Then he gave a curt nod and disappeared into the darkness of the corridor. Adu-Nirari looked at his half-completed inventory, then out through the narrow window at the Black Sea. No light on the horizon. Only the stars, cold and indifferent. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. Adu-Nirari awoke before the first cockcrow. No dream had stirred him, no sound, only an indeterminate unease that had settled over his body like a second skin in the hours before dawn. He lay still on his mat, listening into the darkness, and found nothing but the absence of familiar noises. No wind in the palms before the window, no clatter of fishing boats, which by this time should long have been on the water. He rose, drew the woolen cloak over his shoulders, and stepped out onto the parapet of the harbor fortress. What greeted him was not the shimmering clarity of a Cypriot summer morning, but an impenetrable white that had risen from the sea and swallowed the world. Coastal fog in midsummer, a meteorological impossibility he had not experienced even once in 23 years of service. The moisture instantly condensed on his skin, penetrated the fabric of his cloak, blurred the sharp lines of the architecture, until even the familiar crenellations of the palace wall became faceless shadows. Adu-Nirari stretched out his hand and watched his fingers vanish in the mist. No gulls screamed over the harbor basin, no cedar wood creaked at the mole, The Phoenician bales of cloth, which had fluttered in the morning breeze the day before, hung motionless and damp from their stands. Even the rhythmic slap of the waves seemed muffled, as if someone had spread a heavy carpet over the sea. The silence was so complete that Adunarari could hear his own heartbeat, a dull, rapid thudding that did not fit the morning routine he tried to convince himself he was maintaining. He thought of the extinguished signal fires of Kishan. He thought of the nervous fishermen who had pulled their boats ashore too early the previous day. He thought of the Egyptian envoy, whose words now echoed in his memory, clearer and more threatening than ever before. They come with the first light. Adunarari forced himself to be rational. The fog was a weather phenomenon, nothing more. Moist air over cold water, a rare but explainable event. The silence was an auditory illusion, caused by the dampening humidity. The fishermen were superstitious men who made an omen of every unusual bird flight. He was a scribe, not a sailor. He trusted what he could verify. But as he called the messenger boy and ordered him to fetch the harbor commander for an immediate inspection, his voice trembled almost imperceptibly. The boy ran off, his sandals clapping on the damp stone, and the sound was lost within seconds in the muffled silence of the fog. Twilight had not yet begun to push through the fog when Adunarari heard a sound he could not place, a deep, buzzing hum that grew rapidly louder, like a hornet's, only deeper, more menacing. He turned towards the sea, his hand shielding his eyes, although there was nothing to be seen but wavering whiteness. The burning arrow pierced the mist in a perfect parabola and embedded itself less than 20 yards from him in the cedar roof of the harbor storehouse. The tarred wood caught fire immediately, the flames greedily devouring the centuries-old beams, and for a moment Adunarari was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he saw. Below him, panic broke out. The few harbor workers who had started their shift despite the eerie silence ran in all directions. Some towards the leather buckets, others simply away, meaningless flight reflexes in a chaos that had not yet taken shape. Their screams merged with the crackling of the flames and the buzzing of further arrows now striking rapidly from the fog. Adunarari clawed his fingers into the rough limestone of the parapet and forced himself to look closely. There was something in the mist. Shadows that moved too fast for merchant vessels, too agile for Egyptian galleys. Then the fog parted, and the first boat materialized less than 50 yards from the mole. It was sleek and black, hardly longer than 3 men stretched out, with oars on both sides that rose and fell in perfect synchronization. No sail was set. The bowsprit protruded menacingly from the hull, sharpened bronze wood. As Adunarari now realized, not metal, but cedar wood, hardened with resin and carved into shape, more dangerous than any blade. The boat rammed a Cypriot merchant vessel that was helplessly bobbing in the harbor basin. The splintering crack of planks drowned out all other sounds for a moment, then the ship listed. Water shot into the torn hull, and within a minute nothing remained but a whirlpool of debris and churning sea. Adunarari finally understood what lay before him. The reports from the Levant, which he had dismissed as Egyptian hysteria. The sea peoples without a king, whose existence he had mocked. They were no legend. They were here, and they had reached Nkomi before the sun had pierced the mist. The first boat had barely forced the merchant vessel below the waterline when the mist behind it parted, and Adunarari grasped the true scale of the catastrophe. It was not a handful of ships. There were 20, perhaps more. Black, slender hulls that glided silently out of the mist like wolves from a forest. The oars dipped into the water in perfect rhythm, each stroke bringing them closer, and seated on the benches were men whose faces Adunarari had never seen before. Strange, angular features, some with painted leather over their chests, others naked save for a loincloth. The first warriors leapt into the knee-deep water before their boats even reached the shore. Their armament was lean and deadly, curved short swords of bronze, round shields of woven willow, wicker covered in leather, and some carried throwing spears with barbs. No heavy armor, no chariots, None of the ceremonial pomp Adu-Nirari knew from Egyptian or Hittite troops. These men were built for speed, for the swift thrust and the swifter retreat. Chaos descended upon the defenders at the quay. A Cypriot fisherman, who had been mending his nets just minutes before, rushed towards the attackers with a wooden boat hook, a desperate, almost moving gesture. A Luka warrior evaded the blow with ease, his short sword passing through the man's stomach in a single fluid movement, and the fisherman collapsed before his hook could even touch the stones. Adu-Nirari gripped the parapet, his knuckles white against the limestone. He watched as a troop of 6 warriors moved with purpose past the burning fishing boats towards the copper storehouse. No hesitation, no searching. They knew the layout of Nkomi. They knew where the wealth was stored. Someone had guided them. Someone must have betrayed the locations of the storehouses, the palace gates, the weakest points in the defenses. A second troop cut off the retreat route to the inner courtyard. A third secured the mole. Coordinated, efficient, brutal. Below him, the ordered harbor, whose accounts he had perfected for 23 years, transformed into a battlefield of blood and burning cedar. A young merchantess he recognized by sight, she sold pickled olives from Kishon, was dragged by her hair towards one of the boats. Her screams mingled with the crackling flames and the guttural cries of the attackers in a language that no cuneiform sign in this world had ever recorded. Adu-Nirari registered all of this with the precision of a man who had dedicated his life to documentation. But this time he could not write. This time there was no clay tablet that could transform the horror in his chest into ordered lines. He could only watch as the world, which he had held to be unshakable, crumbled under the blows of the outcasts. The stone steps of the palace were steep and damp with morning mist. Adu-Nirari stumbled more than he ran. His sandals found little purchase on the slippery steps, his hands groping blindly for the wall, while behind him the screams of the dying from the harbor rose up and mingled with the crackling of flames into a cacophony that made clear thought impossible. The inner courtyard was a sea of chaos. Maidservants ran with bundles they had seized in panic and would never need. A young woman carried an empty water jug as if it were a shield. An old cook clutched a wooden spoon like a weapon. The palace commander, a veteran with a gray beard and a voice that usually commanded obedience, shouted contradictory orders into the crowd, which no one heeded. To the north wall, he cried, then secure the gate, then merely hold firm, as if he himself no longer knew which wall still held and which gate had long since fallen. Then the king stood before him. The ruler of Algiers, son of the great goddess, guardian of the copper, a man of middle years with a face that in this hour seemed to have aged by decades. No entourage, no guards, only him, Adu-Nirari, and the burning fortress. Scribe. The king's voice was hoarse, broken, but it still carried the tone of command from 3 generations. Your tablets. Did we foresee this? Was it in the reports? Adu-Nirari opened his mouth, then closed it again. The reports of the Egyptian envoy. The warnings from the Levant. The nervous fishermen, the lit signal fires. Everything had been documented, everything archived, nothing had been heeded. Yes, my lord, he said, and the admission tasted like ash. The reports were there. We did not take them seriously enough. The king stared at him, then nodded slowly, as if he had expected no other answer. Then write now, he said quietly. Write to the pharaoh. Tell him that Algiers is burning. Tell him that we need his help, or what remains of us will be less than ash in the wind. Adu-Nirari understood that this was not a command, but a plea. The king delegated his despair to the only man whose weapon was not the sword, but the stylus. Documentation as the last act of power. Adu-Nirari found his workspace in a state that caused him almost physical pain. The shelves holding the carefully stacked clay tablets had been overturned, broken fragments scattered across the floor like the bones of a slaughtered animal. 23 years of archived order, trampled by foreign boots, soiled with the mud the attackers had brought in from the quay. He knelt and picked up a shard of a treaty with Byblos, one he had personally sealed 6 years prior. There was no time for grief. He dug through the debris with bare hands until his fingers struck an intact tablet, still moist from the clay preparation the day before, unwritten, ready. A small miracle amidst the destruction. He sat on the overturned stool, placed the tablet on his knees, and began to write. The familiar scratching of the stylus calmed his trembling hands, forcing them into the rhythm of 23 years of discipline. Say to Echnaton, king of Egypt, my brother, he incised into the soft clay, the diplomatic opening formula he had written 1,000 times and which now sounded like a prayer. Thus speaks the king of Alashia, outside, wood splintered under a battering ram. Screams, then the dull thud of a body hitting stone. Adu-Narari continued to write that the Luca had come with the fog, that they had burned the stores, sunk the ships, slaughtered the defenders. That the king of Alashia implored his Egyptian brother for military aid, archers, chariots, whatever the pharaoh could spare. His hand moved faster now, the signs less precise, but he could not slow down. Every word he failed to press into the clay in time was a life lost. A piercing scream from the harbor side, abruptly cut off. He paused and looked at the wet tablet in his hands. This message would take a week to reach Amarna, provided it found a ship willing to make the journey. A week until the pharaoh read it. Another week until he reacted. And then weeks, perhaps months, before Egyptian troops could reach Cyprus. The mathematics of diplomacy was a mathematics of delay, and within that delay people lived and died. He finished the final line and pressed the royal seal into the damp clay, harder than necessary. The tablet was ready. Now it simply had to survive. From the window of his study, Adu-Narari watched as the copper storehouse erupted in an orange inferno. The flames devoured the centuries-old cedar wood as if it were dry grass, and beneath it, under the collapsing beams, lay 47 oxhide-shaped bars bearing the royal seal of Alashia. They did not melt. The heat of a wood fire was not sufficient for that, but they were buried under burning wreckage, unreachable and useless, as if they had never existed. The Luca warriors paid no heed to the fire. They had found what they sought, and what they could not carry was to be left for no one. 2 of them dragged one of the smaller bars towards the boats, while a third threw a burning torch into a stack of tarred ship planks stored nearby. The fire greedily jumped from plank to plank, from stack to stack, until the entire quay became a single burning shore. Adu-Narari pressed his forehead against the cool limestone of the windowsill. The smoke stung his eyes, but he could not look away. This was more than plunder. This was the systematic destruction of a kingdom's economic foundation. Without copper, no trade. Without trade, no wealth. Without wealth, no ships, no guards, no future. The Luca had stolen not only gold or slaves, they had severed the lifeblood of Alashia. A movement on the beach drew his gaze. A troop of warriors drove captives towards the boats, young men and women, selected with the precision of cattle traders at a market. He recognized a craftsman who had repaired the palace roof beams for years, a sturdy man with broad shoulders and steady hands. The craftsman stumbled, perhaps over a corpse, perhaps over his own exhaustion, and one of the Lucas struck him on the skull with the shaft of an oar. A single indifferent blow, the man collapsed and remained there. The column moved on as if nothing had happened. Adu-Narari grasped the calculation behind it with the clarity of an accountant reading a foreign balance sheet. The old, the weak, the defiant, they were ballast, not cargo. The pirates selected their plunder according to economic criteria, not out of cruelty. They were not raging barbarians, but cold-blooded entrepreneurs of a new type of war economy. Kidnapping as an industry. The wake of their departing boats closed over the spot where the craftsman would have drowned had he not already been dead. The inner scribe's room was a windowless cell, little larger than a ship's hold. Adu-Narari had bolted the heavy cedar door behind him and barricaded it with an overturned bookcase. 12 people crowded into the stifling darkness, palace servants, 2 apprentice scribes, the old weaver from the storeroom. Only a single oil lamp provided flickering light, its wick already half burnt down. Outside came the systematic hammering of bronze axes against the door. The Luca worked methodically, blow after blow, not in a rage, but with patience, as if they had all the time in the world. Wood splinters detached from the inside and rained down onto the stone floor. Adunarari crouched in the corner, the wet clay tablet on his knees, and continued to write. The scratching of his stylus was the only sound to counter the axe blows, a thin thread of civilized order amidst the impending doom. He corrected a smudged sign, formulated the request for chariots more precisely, and added that the Luca would presumably sail on towards the northwest. A young servant beside him began to pray, soft, rhythmic invocations to the great goddess of Cyprus, said to have been born from the sea foam 1,000 years ago. The old weaver hummed a lullaby, the melody fragile but recognizable. Fragments of humanity in the catastrophe, Adunarari thought, as another splinter broke from the door and the axe head flashed through the fresh hole for the span of a heartbeat. He wrote faster, as if the words could hold the door. Suddenly, silence. It came so abruptly that Adunarari at first took it for a deception, a self-delusion of his overstimulated senses, which could no longer process any noise after 3 hours of unbroken clamor. But the silence held, no hammering at the door, no guttural cries from the mole. No splintering wood. He dared not move. Around him, the 12 survivors held their breath, their faces frozen into staring masks in the flickering glow of the oil lamp. The old weaver had stopped humming. The young servant pressed his fist to his mouth, as if a single unintended sound might call the wolves back. Half an hour passed, or an eternity. In the windowless cell there was no more time, only waiting and listening, and the slow realization that what was happening outside must have changed. Finally, Adunarari rose. His knees ached from hours of crouching on the stone floor. His back protested at every movement. He shoved the overturned bookcase aside, centimeter by centimeter, and withdrew the wooden bolt from its holder. The cedar door, riddled with countless axe blows, swung open, and he stepped out into a world that was no longer his own. The palace courtyard lay beneath a clear midday sky. The fog had dissipated as if it had never existed. Everywhere there were ruins, broken clay vessels, overturned carts. A dead goat, which someone in the panic had failed to untie. But no Luca, no black boats on the shore. Adunarari went to the gate and looked out at the sea. On the horizon, little more than 20 dark points shimmering in the heat. The attackers' ships were disappearing towards the northwest. They were sailing on, to Kitchen, to Ugarit, perhaps to Egypt. This was only the beginning. The sky above Enkomi had cleared, as if to mock the events that had unfolded. Adunarari walked through the rubble, his sandals crunching on broken pottery shards and charred wood splinters. He counted in his mind as he always had, only this time he was not tallying copper ingots, but destruction. The harbor was a single grave of ash and mud. Where 12 merchant ships had been moored yesterday, now only charred mast stumps rose from the water, black and bare like frost-bitten trees. The Phoenician bolts of cloth, which he had admired the morning before, had collapsed into a smoldering pile, their bright colors swallowed by gray smoke. The king stood apart, alone, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He spoke no word. His eyes, which the day before had flashed with authoritative power, stared at the smoking sea, as if searching for something that could no longer be found. Adunarari approached, wanting to say something, a report, a figure, some anchor from the familiar world of facts. But the words stuck in his throat. What could one say to a king whose realm had been shattered in a single morning hour? He turned away and walked on, past overturned fishing carts and abandoned market stalls. Then he stopped. At the foot of the quay wall lay the messenger boy he had sent to the harbor master that morning. The slender body was twisted strangely, the sandals still on his feet, which had run far too fast. Adunarari knelt and closed the boy's eyes. a gesture he had seen his own father perform 30 years ago when the plague had swept through the island village. Why had he sent him? Why had he not investigated himself when the signal fires went out? He rose stiffly, his knees aching, and looked back towards the palace. The work would have to continue, counting the dead, listing the damages, assigning names and rations to the survivors. Someone had to do it. He was the scribe, so he would write, no longer for eternity, but for what remained of that day. The cedar door swung open, and Adunarari stumbled into the harsh midday light. The smoke over Enkomi had thinned to little more than a gray haze hovering above the charred roofs, but the stench of burning wood, molten pitch, and the sweet scent of blood on hot stone still hung in the air like an invisible curtain. He did not go to the dead, not to the ruins of the copper storehouse. He went back into the devastated scriptorium, knelt among the shattered tablets, and dug with bare hands for the one that mattered. His fingers found it intact beneath an overturned shelf, the damp clay tablet bearing the royal seal, the message to Akhenaten, the final official act of a kingdom that might exist for less than a week longer. The clay was still soft. In the heat of the burning palace, it would have baked hard and become useless within an hour. But here, in the cool shadow of the thick limestone walls, it had survived. Adunarari lifted the tablet carefully, as if carrying a newborn, and carried it out to the quay. There, outside the wrecked harbor basin, a single Phoenician trading ship rocked in the gentle afternoon breeze. It had survived the attack because its captain had dropped anchor during the night, far enough from the shore to remain invisible in the fog. Now it lay there, its colorful sails furled, waiting for a tide to carry it away from this burning coast. Adunarari waded through the knee-deep water, holding the clay tablet above his head with both hands like an offering. The Phoenician captain, the same slender man in the dyed woolen cloak who had negotiated rising copper prices the day before, leaned over the railing. "It is dangerous now," the captain said softly. "The Luca are still in these waters. 20 ships, you saw them yourself. They will capture any boat they meet, and they will not bargain." Adunarari extended the tablet towards him. His arms trembled, but his voice was calm, the voice of a man who for 23 years had done nothing other than deliver messages. "The pharaoh will reward the messenger. I give you the royal seal as guarantee. You can show it in Amarna, and Akhenaten will reward you with gold, not copper. With gold which is lighter and goes further than everything you have lost in this harbor." The Phoenician hesitated. Then he nodded curtly and took the tablet, as if it were a burning coal that might scorch his hand at any moment. Without another word, he disappeared into the cargo hold, and Adunarari stood alone in the water, watching as the ship raised its sails and glided slowly out of the devastated harbor. The sun was already low as the Phoenician merchant ship disappeared behind the western headland, and only a thin wisp of smoke could be seen on the horizon, not the smoke of the burning storerooms, but the final traces of a wake dissolving on the smooth sea. Adunarari stood once more on the battlement, where this day had begun, where another man had looked into the fog and seen nothing but weather. He pressed his palms against the warm limestone, the very same stone his fingers had gripped in mortal terror hours before, and tried to fit the events into the order of his thinking. He could not. The categories that had structured his life, trade, diplomacy, administration, had been shattered by the axe blows of the Luca, and what remained was a world without the comforting illusion of predictability. The hostile horizon had not been a one-off threat, an exception, or a caprice of violent strangers. It was a permanent state of affairs, one he had merely overlooked out of convenience. The Luca would return, or others would take their place. Ships without a king, men without land, outcasts for whom the sea was not a boundary, but an artery. As long as there was copper, as long as there were ships to transport it, there would also be those who would plunder it. He began to devise a new administrative plan in his mind. Permanent coastal guards divided into shifts with clear chains of command, beacon fires on every hill from Enkomi to Kishin, manned day and night, the firewood dry and ready. Fortified harbors with stone breakwaters low enough to deflect rams and high enough to provide cover for archers. The logistics were complex, but not impossible. He saw the figures before him, the garrisons, the costs, the diplomatic letters that would have to be written to every ally. Then he thought of the dead, of the messenger boy, of the craftsman with the steady hands, of the weaver whose lullaby still echoed in his head. And he knew that plans took months to become reality, whereas a rowboat needed only hours to cross a horizon. The morning sun was already low over the western sea when Adunirari retrieved a fresh clay tablet from the intact stock and placed it on his knees. The working room was still a ruin, the shattered archives still unsorted, but the stylus in his hand was the same as yesterday and the day before, and as it had been for all the years prior. He began to write. No diplomatic formula this time, no address to a distant pharaoh, only names, the dead of Nkomi, as completely as his memory could supply, the messenger boy, the craftsman with the steady hands, the weaver whose lullaby still echoed in his skull. Then the damages, destroyed storerooms, sunk ships, copper bars buried under charred beams. Then the first outlines of a defense plan, still vague, still full of gaps, but a beginning. The scratching of the stylus was the most familiar sound in the world. It demanded nothing from him but accuracy, and accuracy was the only thing he still had to give. He carried the finished tablet to the parapet and laid it beside him on the warm limestone. Below him, beyond the destroyed harbor, the sea stretched out in the golden hour before sunset, smooth, still, and utterly indifferent to what had happened on its shores. On the horizon, where the Phoenician ship had vanished, a faint streak still showed on the water, the wake. It would soon dissipate, as all traces on the sea eventually did, but something of this day would remain, not in the archives of Nkomi, which had burned, but in a clay tablet now sailing south aboard a foreign vessel, which more than 3,000 years later a scholar in a distant cold land would unearth, read, and understand. Adunirari knew nothing of this distant land. He knew only that the hostile horizon had acquired a name, and that it would never be forgotten again.